Liebe Damen und Herren, Freunde und Freundinnen, ich sage immer nur ein Wort und das heißt willkommen. Willkommen bei uns und willkommen bei dieser wunderbaren Veranstaltungsreihe. Das Wort geht sofort an Dieu Li Huang, die Reihe kuratiert und deswegen auch das Wort hat auf Englisch.
Danke, thank you. Thank you, Benedict. I will switch to English now. Welcome to everyone. I'm very thrilled for the last session of KuK Tuesdays Season 3. And also welcome to our guests, Don Andrew Nguyen and Monica Geneja, and our host, Richard Tsogang-Fossi. I am Li Huang. I am the curator of this event series, and you might know that my co-curator, Freya, is not here tonight, so she wanted to say hi, as usual, with a video message. Let's look at it together.
Hello and welcome. I am Freya Schwachenwald. I am a PhD candidate here at the Institute for Modern Art History, and I'm also one of the co-curators of the event series KuK Tuesdays Dislocation, together with Dieu Li Huang. As you can see, I can't be with you tonight, but I still wanted to use the opportunity to express my gratitude to everyone involved in organizing this event, to Li for staying on the ground while I can't be there due to research that I'm doing abroad, and also to everyone else who is helping in making this event happen. And finally, I also wanted to give you a few words of introduction to tonight's event, why we have decided to put together a panel on the topic of dislocation and unlearning. We believe that the question of unlearning is crucial to critical research in art history today, but also to the kind of artistic and activist practice. And as with the event series KuK Tuesdays Dislocation, we want to bring together scholars, artists, and activists working on questions of dislocation. We thought that it would be really important to also question the kind of categories, concepts, ideas, geographies that we are using in our practice, and to think about the kind of colonial past and presents that are inscribed into the art world and into art history. So I'm really excited that we have such a wonderful panel here tonight with Professor Dr. Monica Geneja, Don Andrew Nguyen, and Richard Tsogang-Fossi as our host. And I hope that you will have a great and lively discussion. Ask all the questions you have. This is the idea of this evening. And also check out our program for the upcoming semester, because we still have a lot of events planned for the next months, and it would be great to see many of you again. So have a great evening, and thank you.
So that was Freya. And I will now present to you our host for tonight, my dear colleague, Richard Tsogang-Fossi. Richard Tsogang-Fossi holds a PhD in German studies, specializing in literature, colonial history, memory, and research into the prominence of cultural heritage in the colonial context. In recent years, he has been involved in several research projects on transnational colonial history and memory in Cameroon and Germany. On school textbooks as vehicles of colonial memory, and on the exhibition project Hey Hamburg, Do You Know Douala Mangabel at the Mark Museum, Hamburg, which aimed at breaking some mainstream narratives on the German colonization. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Technische Universität Berlin as part of the joint research project Reverse Collections Histories, mapping Cameroonian art and culture in German museums, funded by the DFG and directed by professors Albert Guafo and Benedict Savoy. The project resulted in the book Atlas der Abwesenheit, Kameruns Kulturerbe in Deutschland. And I am very thrilled to give you the floor right now, Richard, and have fun.
Yes, thank you very much, Lee, for the kind introduction. And I also wish you welcome here tonight. And it's an honor for me also to be here to have this responsibility of moderating this last panel. I would like to commence with a short story. So this this is how we are going to work. So just to let you know, and I would like to commence with a short story, like I was saying. In his novel that you see here, L'Aventure ambiguë, from the Senegalese writer Cheikh Hamidou Kane, he speaks of the life of the young Dialobe boy who is called Samba Diallo and who is growing up in a Muslim family. But soon after, there is need to send that child to the new school, which has been brought during French colonization. And the person who has the say on this decision is the aunt of that boy, who is called La Grande Royale. And what is the decision of La Grande Royale? Her decision is that Samba Diallo should go to the new school instead of the Muslim school. And what is her reason? It is simple. Her reason is that Samba Diallo should learn how to defeat without being right. That is her reason. How to defeat without being right. If you apply this story to the various artifacts taken from the colonies in Africa, Pacific America during the colonial era, we realize one thing. Most of these artifacts were forcibly removed and incorporated into the cultural property of the various colonial states in accordance with their Eurocentric principles such as the inalienability. This brings us back to the Grande Royale and showcases the way in which Europe has destroyed cultural system without being right, and the way in which it has taken cultural property hostage. Also, how Europe grants itself the right of cultural heritage and deprives others of the same right. How does it fit in our discussion today? Colonial Europe has been so accustomed to defeating without being right that everything it has plundered, presumably brought, and peoples that it has forcibly displaced in order to wage its colonial wars have appeared as fait accompli. Demands for restitutions from the communities of origin appear somewhat like ingratitude, because Europe feels that it has taken care of these things for so long. As a result, some acts of restitution sometimes look like goodwill or charity, rather than as means of righting the wrongs that it has spread in communities like wildfire in the winds or dark clouds in the sky. Unlearning colonialism today, or how can we approach the questions of colonialism today in its deepest assumptions? How can we break down the mainstream narratives in order to create new epistemologies and synergies? How do we deal with the ghosts, specters, afterlives, traumas, nightmares, and suffering that have taken hold of our memories and hound us day and night because all our nerves, veins, and sinuses have been conquered and turned down by horror, tortured by grief, and saturated by despair. How can we deal with the residues of persistent structural or epistemological violence? How can we overcome the haunting effects of war and subjugation on the displacement of peoples and torn identities and their legacies? Using the synagogue of a camera shooter, Aisha Azulai underlines what unlearning imperialism means. The camera shutter is a symbol of imperial practices of violence based on exclusion, unilateral transformation of people's lives and property according to the imperial master's law. She says, as you can read, unlearning imperialism aims at unlearning its origins, found in the repetitive moments of the operation of imperial shutters. Unlearning imperialism refuses the story the shutter tells. Such unlearning can be pursued only if the shutter's neutrality is acknowledged as an exercise of violence. In this way, unlearning imperialism becomes a commitment to reversing the shutter's work. This reversal must overcome the dissociation between people and objects which the experts specialize. Imperial shutters are operated and controlled by experts of different sorts who are mandated to determine how the commons is to be exploited, what could be extracted out of it, and under which circumstances. In an attempt to unlearn the histories of colonial collections, for example, a team of this university decided to approach colonial collections from Cameroon in German museums from the perspective of reverse collection stories. The important thing is not where the objects are, but also where they come from, why, and under which circumstances they were removed. What happened to the void left behind, and what forms of resilience they are. The result is not only the considerable number of objects hidden in German museums, which amounts 40,000, as was disclosed by the study, but also evidence are made how colonialism enabled cultural extractivism. And here you can also have an example when Frobenius was saying that German museums grew up fatter like pregnant hippopotamuses. And this also resulted in spreading Cameroonian heritage all over the world. As you can see from this map, the red thread is obviously things that came during colonial period. And that is for Germany, but also you can see how this heritage was spread all over the world. So this resulted obviously in alienation, zombification, annihilation. As Olai puts it again, this is what unlearning imperialism looks like. It means unlearning the dissociation that unleashed an unstoppable movement of forced migration of objects and people in different circuits of and the destruction of the worlds of which they were part. Today, we are welcoming two special guests with different profiles who are going to help us open new perspectives on this issue. The main assumptions of colonialism and coloniality, the question of invisibilization of inferiorized and repressed knowledge forms, etc. We have a renowned researcher and art historian, Professor Monica Juneja, and an artist, Tuan Andrew, talks, for example, of unburied sounds of troubled horizon, probably those of terrifying and destructive wars that still resonate within us, near us, within us, against us, such as the bombs, and which also show us the perfection that human being has put in killing other human beings. How many people have been torn from their homes, from Senegal to Vietnam, from India to Kenya, from Cameroon to South Africa, wives, mothers, husbands, children, and so on, to wage colonial wars, while crying and they'd never find help, while hoping for freedom and meeting rather death. How does this resonate today in our destabilized identities? So Monica, Juneja, and Tuan will reflect with us through the prism of art history and artistic intervention on what unlearning colonialism implies in the post-colonial and decolonial age, but also will also reflect on some moments of incoherence and incoherentness, also internal contortions and complexities, and also some forms of mimicry. So with this, I would like now to introduce our guest to you, and I would like to start with Professor Monica Juneja, who is, like I was saying, art historian at the University of Heidelberg and distinguished professor of arts and humanities in Shivnaka University, that's in India. She has written extensively on transculturation and visual representation. The disciplinary practices of art history in South Asia, the history of visuality in early modern South Asia, and also heritage and architectural histories in transcultural perspective. Her latest book, Can Art History Be Made Global? Meditations from the Periphery, that was in 2023, received the Opus Magnum Award of the Volkswagen Foundation. She is also the recipient of the prestigious Mayer Struckman Prize, awarded for excellence in the humanities and social sciences, and the 2024 Distinguished Teaching of Art History Award of the CAA. So I wouldn't like to go back to her so many publications. I would just like to mention here that Monica Juneja also edits the series Visual and Media Histories, that's Routledge, and is on the editorial board of Die Materialität, Geschichte, Ästhetische Praxis, History and Humanities of the University of Chicago Press, and co-editor of Journal of Transcultural Studies. So she's a member of the advisory board of the Walter Benjamin Colleague, at the University of Bern, the Tate Hyundai Research Center, and to finish, London and the Deutsches Zentrum für Kulturgutverluste that supports provenance research as objects acquired in colonial contexts. So with this, I would like to give us straightforward the floor. Thank you very much.
Yes, good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, Benedict, Freya, and Lee. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here in this series. I've watched some of your earlier programs online, and I was really impressed by the liveliness of the discussions. And thank you, Richard, for that very generous introduction. Okay, so for once I'm speaking without a PowerPoint, which is a bit of a strange experience for me as an art historian. But since my statement today is focuses more on theoretical, sometimes abstract issues rather than objects, I don't have anything, maybe just one slide to show, which is my book. But then rest assured, I will be followed by an artist who will then give you a much more lively presentation with his work. So, as Richard introduced me, I speak here as an art historian, and I'm concerned with the epistemic foundations of the discipline of art history. And my work is about responding to the discipline as it is practiced today, with all its underlying assumptions and conceptual categories. And my response comes from a position that has generally been regarded as peripheral, that is beyond the Euro-American axis. I'm a historian of South Asian art. And so we need to ask, how can we make this plurality of experiences, resources, which come from outside of this self-styled mainstream, how can we make this globally intelligible? And instead of just, relegating it to one secluded area that happens in a lot of institutional setup here in universities in the West. And the larger question from there is, how can we make art history into a less parochial, a non-hierarchical discipline, something that's more capacious in that we bring back the suppressed forms of knowledge that you also mentioned, Richard, and how can we bring back marginalized and erased subject positions into the heart of the discipline? So the book which I recently published, which Richard mentioned, and here I put it here on the slide, which actually addresses all these questions. And I think what I'm going to present today is, is drawn from there. So I want to begin by querying that, the sort of the disciplines we practice. In my case, it's art history, but I think what I have to say can apply to other humanities and the social sciences as well. When we start, unearthing the presuppositions that they transport. And these, presuppositions are linked there, to the context in which these disciplines were formed and the epistemic foundations on which they continue to rest. So what is the knowledge that they produce, in this case, art history? What are the blind spots that are a consequence of the hierarchies and claims a discipline such as art history carries? And are our disciplines complicit with practices of exclusion, discrimination, even violence? And these are phenomena which then take us beyond the academic context, but is there a relationship between the two? And then from here, what are then the forms of unlearning, which is the key word for today's session, unlearning and relearning, that might be called for here. And just responding to some of the discussions that we had, a question I want to also place for discussion is this unlearning confined to colonialism, or imperialism alone? If there are residual structures from the past that we have inherited today, are these just unchanged continuations, or are these structures also enter into relationships with later developments and produce different kinds of constellations? So are we simply just saying, we want to sort of unlearn colonialism, or what are we asking, what has happened to the colonial past? What does it mean today? What is the form in which it exists today? What is it complicit with? What are the other systems it's complicit with? So these are some of the questions I want to place before you, and I want to sort of look, use the example of South Asia. So art history today is a discipline that's practiced all over the world, or in many countries of the world. So it's no longer confined to the West, to Euro-America. It has traveled to different corners of the world. It has found new roots. And where it is also, we can't even say it's simply an imposition from the outside, because it has found new roots. And yet we have to ask, what is the cultural baggage it carries? So let's begin with this particular baggage. Now, I can't take you through the entire history of art history here, but I want to simply point to the fact that the discipline, like many others in the humanities and social sciences, took decisive shape in the context of nationalism and imperialism in the 19th century. And as you have been discussing here for many sessions, this is a time when large quantities of objects from across the world entered Europe through different channels and became part of museums. And these presented an enormous challenge. The challenge was to curators, to scholars, to publics, and the challenge was also to the discipline of art history, because the discipline of art history was fixated on classical antiquity. So it had to find ways of making sense of these objects which came from all over. And art history was expected to fulfill this need. It was expected to produce a set of concepts and methods, to not only to understand these objects, but also to attach a certain value to them, to place them in a system of classification. So how to bring then the rest of the world that's present through its objects into a discipline which till now has been focused on Europe. So to cut a long story short, I have the first chapter of my book is actually dedicated to this, how does the world get included in art history. To just summarize it in 2 sentences, this bringing the world into art history took its cue from evolutionist thinking. And this is something that my chapter, studies these art historical texts, which where evolutionist thinking provides scholarship with a kind of developmental scheme. There's a civilizational ladder which starts from the so-called primitive, and how the primitive is defined is something also I discuss, up to the most developed, the modern European. So this is essentially a biological model. It's a biological model, but which has been applied to culture. And art was defined as something that all human societies possessed. So it's ostensibly an expansive definition, but then it goes hand in hand with a form of relativism. So because these societies, however, are placed in hierarchies. These hierarchies follow their levels of development. So art serves then as a key to access a distinct culture. And the state of evolution of a group of people, and this is what the authors of these art histories that I analyze propose, the state of evolution could be read from the material surface of any art object. So you could have an archaeological fragment, you could have a carpet, you could have a bronze deity, a cave drawing, or a painted scroll. If a particular art is judged to be raw or ugly, or attractive, then the same must be inferred about its makers and the entire culture which is ascribed to it. So art history then, at the time it's produced, it takes this decisive shape. It was about world making. It was about producing narratives about the world that at the same time provided a foil against which the meaning of one's own time, the present, a national culture could be deciphered. And this natural culture was important to bind the nation as an enduring collective. And this had to be fabricated. So the world is a foil against which the identity of the nation gets fabricated. And these narratives then are replicated in museums, as I think most of you are familiar with. A lot of people here work on museums. And art history and museum practice develop in tandem. One reinforces the other. So the ways of organizing displays in the museums, or which museums take what objects, is also, replicates this evolutionist scheme. Now, this is just in a nutshell, the baggage which art history carries. The underlying premise of this art history is a certain definition of culture. That is, culture is something which is hermetically sealed within a national container. And that container works to homogenize culture, to therefore bring it in the service of national belonging. And this evolutionary model of culture comes then to be replicated in the procedures and methods of art history as it was professionalized in the emerging nation states. So let me just take you one example that, that is a method that we all practice in art history without really thinking about it, is the concept of style. The style is a central category of the discipline. Style is a category of the discipline that's based on typological analysis, but it has been developed into a convenient tool to coordinate and to stabilize mobility, to stabilize the metamorphoses of forms. So this idea of stylistic development, which is now anchored in art history, implies a certain scheme which you have to artificially maintain by treating each geographical location as self-contained. So you have to suppress the plurality of agency or the circulation of objects or forms of practices, and then you have a style that is anchored to one location. Now, this is one example then of these taxonomies, and values that are built into the discipline, which emerges at this time. And the whole these hierarchies of genres, for example, which are also hierarchies of values, and all of these, for those of us who study art history, know that they also mean the marginalization and suppression of many other different forms of knowledge, which now we need to bring back center stage. Okay, so this is the baggage the discipline carries. Let's look now, for example, what happens to it when it's introduced in a region outside of Europe. For example, as part of colonial education system. That's how art history traveled to many regions of the world. But then it gets transcultured there as a part of nation building. That nation building, to start with, is anti-colonial. And so what are the changes it undergoes in this project of anti-colonial nation building, and what are the premises that don't change, which remain unchanged? And to ask today, the premises that don't change, are they simply a residue of coloniality, or is something else happening there? Now, this is, and most of my examples come from South Asia as one, a post-colonial region. And I'd like to say here that, colonialism is a vast and a complex and a differentiated phenomenon. There's a lot of work, especially in this university. If the work that Benedict has done for Africa and all the students you have trained, if we had that kind of work for other regions of the world, we could compare much more effectively. And what we have to be a bit careful about is not to use that wonderful work as a model, then to understand the rest of the world. Now, to take the example of the Indian subcontinent, which is something I've discussed in my book, when you cast off the colonial yoke, it's also an act of writing your own history, inventing your own cultural traditions. And these cultural traditions then, in these new emerging nation states, they also get showcased in institutions such as museums, cultural heritage, and they are given a scholarly foundation in art history. Art history played a very important role in emancipating a nation from colonial domination, because when a group of people carry with them this stigma of cultural inferiorization, and so the new disciplines and institutions, are they're harnessed to eradicate colonial stereotyping and this castigation of colonized cultures as uncivilized, as stagnant, unscientific. We know all these stereotypes. So one way of restoring dignity to these colonized cultures is through the category of art, because the objects that were initially put in as ethnological objects or antiquities were denied the status of art. Art history allows you to dignify them and bring them back as into the status of art. So that's why the discipline is very important in the process of nation building in an anti-colonial context. Now, we have to ask, however, what are the assumptions and that are used then in art history as it develops in these regions outside of the world. And one important observation to make here is that nations are formed of different communities, and not all communities speak with one voice. They also don't all speak from the same position as the official voice of the nation state. Each nation state, wherever in the world it may be located, irrespective of it, whether it was a colonizer or a colonized nation, each nation state manufactures its own version of the past, and it does so by privileging certain strands of culture, which then become mainstream national, and others then are relegated to categories, which then are also hierarchy. So you have folk traditions, you have minority cultures, you have migrant cultures, even though they may have been, sort of part of that nation's history for many years, but it is it's the nation state which doesn't speak for all the communities. So creating then this vision of, a unique, authentic culture, which is a strategy of nation building, and this in turn also affects denial, repression. For example, longer histories of migration in most nations are denied. It's, migration is always generally seen as, contaminating the purity of culture. So certain strands and groups are privileged, the others get marginalized. You see this also in the museums, what objects get placed where. So though art history has become a discipline now practiced across the globe, it has remained trapped in different shades of parochialism. And I would like to argue that Eurocentrism and imperialism on the one hand, and methodological nationalism on the other, are actually two faces of the same coin, because they use very similar methods and they rest, on similar assumptions. So, and definitions of culture. So the unlearning and relearning that we're talking about, I think, requires first a different ontology of culture, which is linked from the territorial frame, or rather delinked from the territorial frame of the nation state. And this, again, raises a lot of questions about what I said at the beginning, the continuities of colonial structures or their transformations, and what is the kind of language to use, when we look at internal modes of discrimination, hierarchization, marginalizations of group who make the, who make up the nation. Can we use terms like decolonial to describe any kind of critical move? What does that do for us? What does it flatten in experiences? I think we have to ask these questions about when we look at it. Look at very particular histories, and we look at how something like colonialism didn't drop from the heavens. It also emerged in a context, of modernization, of nation building, of the search for new markets, and the kind of effects it has in the different regions. Also, the different forms it takes. Settler colonialism is one thing, and other forms of colonialism, have work in different ways. But I want to come back to art history, and I want to just make 2 points here before I stop. When I talk about repression of knowledge, experience, repression of subject positions. Now, one challenge that we all face when we work with different regions of the world. Today, the language of scholarship is basically European languages. Most scholars, even those writing in other regions of the world, end up writing in a European language if they want to be read and taken seriously and understood. So we're talking here in English, or we might write in German or in French, and all our terminologies of art history come from these European languages. So the words we use, art, image, vision, portrait, I mean, a whole genres I've discussed in the book, is the language of scholarship. And thanks today, through biennials, through this whole, global art world, this language has become ubiquitous. And yet, does it carry the same baggage everywhere? What happens, when terminologies, travel from one place to the other, but they then enter into negotiations with other linguistic sources? So as a scholar, I have to examine, what kinds of languages are used, for particular forms of art making, and what happens to those when we then just take up a term as art or craft or all these hierarchies that art history carries, and what gets repressed there. What is so if you go to a museum, you'll still see, for example, let me take an example from India. So you had these sort of temple structures, entire temple walls, and from there maybe one fragment is taken and it comes into a museum vitrine. Suddenly it becomes sculpture. Or a page from a manuscript then gets framed and hung on a wall as a miniature. You call it painting. So there's a kind of taxonomical transformation which is taking place, which we have to take stock of. We have to understand how this is happening. And many times these are also hierarchies. Sculpture, painting are genres which are considered high art, in a context which has also now spread across the globe. If I go back to the Indian subcontinent and I look at my sources, I find, for example, for textiles, there is a very, very nuanced, differentiated, refined language to describe every single aspect of weaving, of dyeing, of printing, of different forms of making textiles. It's an entire language of art. So now what happens to these these genres? And this is the forms of repression that I'm talking about, that a discipline brings, which we need to take stock of. It brings repression. It also brings fragmentation in art worlds, as we see in contemporary art worlds in different regions. But I don't have time to go into that. Okay, that's one of the issues that I think we need to, when we're talking about unlearning and relearning, we need to keep in mind. And finally, and this is something I've added on because I listened to some of your tapes, the earlier discussions, and there was this one of the discussions was about cosmopolitanism and whether it's a useful word. For me, cosmopolitanism carries certain positive connotations, but it also today has become a luxury of those who can move around freely and travel and don't have to be subject to all kinds of bodily routines that some other less privileged members of the globe have to do. I'm also now taking my cues from some of the work contemporary artists are doing. And another concept that we might want to think of taking it back to its core meaning, delinking it, unlearning it, from sort of Eurocentric colonialism, is the notion of universalism. Now, universalism it's been battered by post-colonial theory, because it's seen as a Eurocentric claim. It's a subject of critique. It's seen as something that brought both epistemic and real violence, to the areas it affected. It's part of a colonial civilizing mission, etc., etc., etc. At the same time, what we forget is that universalism was also appropriated by long struggles, against, struggles for justice, struggles for liberation, the fight against apartheid, Black Lives Matter. All of these movements work with a particular concept of universalism, something which Hannah Arendt called the right to have rights. And I think that's a kind of universalism that we could restore to humanity. And, Susan Buck-Morss has this very unforgettable expression. She says, she's talking about radical anti-slavery critiques across Europe and in Haiti. And she says it's something that belongs to no one, but because it belongs to everyone. And I think today, when we come back to this question about colonial structures, which now join hands with other kinds of repression that we are faced with, facing, xenophobic nationalism, for example, neo-fascism, is not something confined only to one region of the world. It cuts across the globe. It's not just, a product of so-called white societies. You have it across the world. So maybe we want to make different kinds of alliances, and using maybe something that the term universalism has as its core. Maybe that could become a tool instead of this call, as I would say, to sort of decolonize everything, because that's not enough. I don't think it takes us far enough. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks very much, Monica, for this wonderful presentation. So I would like to maybe try here to summarize. I would just like maybe to mention the fact that you spoke about these taxonomies of the disciplines and also the concept attached to it, and also how nation building is a form of anti-colonial attitude that we can also cope with. And we also spoke of forms of emancipation, these forms of colonial stereotyping that can be rejected through art and art history. And also the fact that terminologies travel, for example, enter into dialogue with other forms of linguistics, with other forms of linguistic realities, and carry changes in them. So those are just some of the aspects of this wonderful issues that you have raised as concern unlearning, colonialism, and imperialism. So allow me now to go straight to our next guest, who is Tuan Andrew Nguyen. He is from, he was born in Saigon, where he lives and works in Ho Chi Minh City, that's in Vietnam. And he's an artist whose work utilizes strategies of remembrance to highlight unofficial and suppressed histories, interweaving the factual and the speculative, and often employing mythologies of otherworldly realms. Nguyen's film reworks dominant narratives into stories that propose creative forms of healing the intergenerational traumas of colonialism, war, and displacement through the interest in animism and material memory. The affective and historical charge embedded into objects, Nguyen's installations, and sculptural practices coincide with the expand of the themes explored in this film that he's going to present to us. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. Thank you, Professor Benedict, and you, Lee, and Faya, for having me here today. What an honor it is to be here in conversation with Richard and Professor Monica. Do we have a clicker to... Thank you very much. I have not rehearsed this thing, so please bear with me. This way. See, I told you. I don't. Okay. First of all, I'm going to start with an apology. Please excuse my bad pronunciation of French terminology, especially you, Benedict. When I was growing up in Texas, I had a whole bunch of aunts and uncles arrive who immigrated into the U.S. from this place called Martinique. And I was always very curious about Martinique because all my cousins spoke French and my aunts and uncles had lived there for such a long time. And I had a grand uncle who stayed in Martinique. And I was very curious because and I didn't find out until much later that it was about 10 years ago, he returned to Vietnam. And I spent a lot of time with him kind of, shooting this, talking and over drinks and beers. And he actually told me that he ended up in Martinique because he got recruited by the French military. This is right before the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which is the battle that saw the end of the French Empire in Vietnam. And then he actually spent time in Algeria during the revolution there. And then after that was over, he was shipped to an outpost in this beautiful Caribbean island called Martinique. And I was like, wow, this is an amazing story. And, I then, started to, in college, started to read Frantz Fanon and Glissant, and who were all from Martinique. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And it turns out that my granduncle was a tirailleur. He was a colonial soldier of the French military. So, starting in the 19th century, the French military started recruiting and training young men from the colonies to maintain French military presence within these colonies, as well as to expand their colonial territories. And these soldiers were known as riflemen, or by their French term, tirailleurs. This is an old poster from a French newspaper that I found that kind of glorifies the colonial soldiers of the French army. Sorry, oops. So the three largest kind of tirailleur regiments were tirailleurs sénégalais, which was the term applied generally to the black soldiers from West Africa. Tirailleurs Indochinois was applied to the colonial soldiers from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, which was at that time known as French Indochine or Indochina. And then the North African tirailleurs were raised in French North Africa from the Arab and Berber populations of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. So they were tirailleurs North Africans. Sorry, I'm clicking my iPad and the thing at the same time. So, some images of tirailleurs Indochinois, tirailleurs sénégalais. Oops. Hundreds of thousands of tirailleurs, unbeknownst to many of us, were sent from the various countries, the various colonies, to Europe to fight in defense of France during World War I and World War II. Hundreds of thousands. So this is just some archival footage I found that I put together that looks at the kind of the way that the French gaze. This is all military footage, archival footage from the French military. How the French gaze was looking at these tirailleurs and how they were training them. But I'll skip to the next one. This is a photo that I found in the German archives, actually, and this photo was taken in 1917, which is at the end of World War I, and it's actually taken in a POW camp by an unknown photographer in the German army. I won't go too much into it, but it's a very perplexing and kind of captivating photo where you see all these prisoners of war, and they're from these French colonies, so they're all these tirailleurs. And you can tell by the notation that was made in the upper right-hand corner that they're from Senegal, Guinea, Somali, which I assume is French Somaliland, which is now known as Djibouti, Tunisia, Annam, which is the name given to the central part of Vietnam by the French during their 100 years of colonization, Sudan, and this is French Sudan, which is now part of Mali, and then Dahomey, which is now currently Benin. Captivating photo for many reasons, but I'll talk about that later. So, over the 5 years of World War I, 170, almost 180,000 soldiers were recruited from French West Africa, and then almost 100,000 Indo-Chinese tirailleurs were brought over to participate in the war effort. The same World War II saw the same usage of tirailleurs, but shortly after World War II, an uprising began in Vietnam, and this uprising was against French colonialism. And interestingly enough, the French started sending their tirailleurs from Africa over to Vietnam to squash the rebellion. And the French sent about 60,000 African soldiers to Indochine. 78% of these were from French West Africa, and the highest percentage of those soldiers were from Senegal. This is a photo of General Võ Nguyên Giáp, who was the mastermind behind this revolution, and he's speaking to African prisoners of war, and this is noted as a photo taken in 1950. So during the long occupation of the French and the extended war, many soldiers, of course, both French and colonial, had relationships and had children with Vietnamese women during the occupation of Vietnam. These women and children, after the French were kicked out in 1954 after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, faced real danger because they were marked with the residue of the colonizer. So the revolutionary kind of government forces did not like this. And many of them had no choice but to leave Vietnam. So there was a migration of hundreds, if not thousands, we're not quite sure, of Vietnamese women and children from Vietnam to West Africa. This here is a really beautiful, gorgeous family photo taken during Tết, which is the Vietnamese New Year celebration. But this is Tết in Dakar in 1958. And it's a photo in the collection of my friend Jean-Claude Do, who you can see sitting as a little boy, sitting with his mother in the lower left-hand corner of the photo. So I began meeting and sharing stories with people from this community, people from mostly Dakar and Malika. Just gonna flip through some photos. Trying to coordinate too. It's like I'm doing a choreography up here. This is a beautiful image by from a collection of a friend. His name is Usman Fai. It's okay, then I'll have to coordinate with you, and then that'll be a very interesting choreography. But in addition to these stories of love and solidarity, that people were telling me, I also started picking up on different stories of traumas and silences and erasures that happened in their personal lives. And I started seeing these erasures, these silences, it harked at a larger kind of trauma left by the colonial enterprise. Concurrent to these issues of, erasures and silences, the community were also dealing with other issues, relating to this idea of memory. A few years prior to my meeting and working with the community there, an organization called Kim Hoi had been established by a woman named Mary Tiva and a few of her friends. And Mary Tiva is a first generation. So she's the first generation of children that were born to these Vietnamese mothers that migrated to Senegal. And these children and grandchildren who grew up together in a fairly close-knit community, created by the Vietnamese mothers who kind of band together, they started to realize that they were only meeting each other in funerals because all the mothers were passing away. This is Mary Tiva on the microphone. And these children in their 60s and 70s now realize that their memories, their identities that were so impacted by their mothers were on the edge of being forgotten. Images. And also in the community, I met a wonderful woman by the name of Anne-Marie Nyane, who eventually became a collaborator in this project that I did. She had written a novella called L'étranger, translated as The Foreigner. And it's a really interesting kind of short story where she essentially writes about her parents' relationship, and particularly from her mother's point of view, her mother's experience in migrating from Vietnam to Senegal, and then suddenly being faced with all these issues of polygamy and assimilation and language and not being able to address any of it with her husband or her children. And Anne-Marie does something very, very interesting. She begins to fictionalize those moments that were not available to her as a child of this woman, all those kind of emotional dimensions that her mother kept inside. And Anne-Marie fills the gaps and the kind of psychological challenges that her mother wasn't able to share or express to her husband or her children.
En fait, c'est un peu reconstruire l'histoire. Parce que là où la mémoire ne joue plus, l'imagination fait le reste. Et c'est important quelquefois de rebâtir une histoire. Parce qu'on peut se reconstruire en rebâtissant une histoire.
I found this quite inspiring, and I had made some projects that kind of dealt in the speculative space prior to this, but I felt quite moved by her approach, and we kind of really synced in our approaches. And so we kind of began this project with the idea of rebuilding and using fiction to do so. So the project is called The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming. And it's a project in collaboration with the Senegalese Vietnamese community in Senegal, who are now in their 5th or 6th generation, I believe. And it embarks on trying to address these issues of erasure. The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming is a 4-channel video and sound installation. It's immersive. It's set up in a square configuration, so you kind of enter a space. And it features 3 main vignettes that together are kind of fragmented, but address these issues of memory and erasure. And somehow together talks about past, present, and future kind of simultaneously. And the 3 vignettes were written in collaboration with Anne-Marie Nyane, Makadou Njai, Mary Bay Juf. And they attempt to address the silences in their very personal kind of experiences. I'd like to kind of speak a little bit about each one of the vignettes because I think it's really important to kind of share their stories. Anne-Marie Nyane was born in Saigon, and she remembers the silence between her Senegalese father, who was a soldier in the French army, and her Vietnamese mother, especially the days before they had to leave Vietnam. It was very tense. But she recalls that her mother really had no voice in these conversations, and she had no choice whether or not she wanted to stay or leave. So in Anne-Marie's rewriting of this scene, in her version of this moment, her mother finally gets to speak her mind. And she's able to express all the worries, all the concerns, all the problematics, all the kind of tying together of different kind of cultures into this scene. And essentially Anne-Marie gives her mother a voice again. Sorry, this is awkward. Okay, Makadou and Jai. It's all good. It's okay. Makadou and Jai grew up in Senegal. He always had a feeling that there was something missing. Makadou is 68 years old this year. He was born in 1956, and he's a lawyer with a practice in Thiès, Senegal. So he follows his father's footsteps. His father is also a lawyer, was also a lawyer. But before his father became a lawyer, he was a soldier in the French army. And in the 70s, when Makadou was about 20 years old, as he was going through law school, he was coincidentally rummaging through his father's office, and he finds a suitcase with all this stuff, letters and photos from the time that his father was in Europe and in Vietnam. And he finds a letter. Oops. He finds a letter sent to his father by a woman named Nguyen Thi Châu. And in this letter, the only letter that was in the suitcase, the letter spoke about a child named Makadou. Now, Makadou and Jai, my friend, thought that his father had another child and gave the child the same name. This is something very popular to do, like to give a namesake in Senegal. But then Makadou started putting all the pieces together and realized that the woman, that the child that this Vietnamese woman was holding in the picture was actually him. So essentially, there he is. Makadou grew up not knowing he was of mixed heritage, that he was Métis. And this was the thing that always kind of came and plagued him psychologically. He was never told by his father that he was half Vietnamese and that his mother was left behind in Vietnam. So as you can imagine, this discovery, this moment, defined, or rather redefined his life, and it challenged all of his notions of identity, community, politics, war, and so on and so forth. And, you know, while his father was alive, Makadou was never able to confront his father about this. He left all of the material out, so his father knew that he knew. But because of the cultural traditions in Senegal, it was very difficult for Makadou to kind of engage his father in this kind of conversation. Probably also, you know, the patriarchal structures of the family in Senegal also was very difficult to make space for these conversations to happen. So Makadou writes a scene that happens at his father's law firm. Makadou, in the scene, confronts his father about these secrets, about this act of erasing a part of his life. Then Makadou declares to his father that he has given his first daughter the name of his biological mother, Nguyen Thi, a namesake, an act of resistance, an act of remembrance. And he does this in real life. He gave his daughter the name of his mother, who he never met. And in the scene, all of the things unsaid were finally said. This is a clip, but I'll skip. Mary Bay Diouf, she's a poet. She's published some books and poetry. She's a wonderful woman. She told me many times about the wonderful love story between her grandmother and her grandfather when they were in Vietnam. How her grandmother hid this French soldier from Africa in her house in the village to protect him from being captured and killed. Her grandmother even stood in front of rifles held by Vietnamese soldiers who threatened to kill her if she didn't reveal his whereabouts. And this woman, strong Vietnamese woman, stood unmoved. Mary Bay remembers the daily ritual of combing her grandmother's hair after lunch. This is something that she would do almost every day. But her grandmother would speak very rarely about her past. Indochine, Vietnam, was a lost memory to her grandmother. She knew she was never going to return. So Mary Bay writes a beautiful scene remembering a moment that never happened. As she combs her grandmother's hair, she feels in her grandmother's silence and refusal to talk about Vietnam with a very poetic conversation where grandmother and granddaughter kind of traverse time and space, traverse love and war, and the many lives of many different tirailleurs. So the three scenes were written with my collaborators. They were fictional scenes again, scenes based on very concrete personal memories and experiences, but they address these erasures by kind of filling in these spaces, these voids, these kind of silent moments with fiction, with imagination. They're essentially words that weren't shared when people were alive, but are now kind of a way to fill in the silences and the blank spaces left by those traumas. So just quickly about the form of the installation. So in one channel, you would see my collaborators read the dialogue that they wrote. On the opposite channel were people from the community, non-professional actors, enacting the scene, moving in slow motion and syncing their lips to the voice of the writer. Other screens would have archival images or photographs or footage that expands or complicates the narrative that is spoken. And it's a very kind of experiential, has a very experiential effect that's very spatialized. So the viewer essentially completes the final edit of the film by the movement of their heads and their bodies and the shifting of their perspectives in space. So essentially, theoretically, you can never see the same film twice, technically. Viewers have noted that they always feel like they're missing something, right, no matter where they look. And this is the kind of space of memory that I was trying to kind of create through this visuality. It's has a hallucinogenic effect. And with that, I'd like to kind of leave you with this last quote by Sandra. Post-memory shares an important feature with hallucination. It uses imagination to produce the object of one's thought, the thing one desires, in a manner that one can take possession of it. However, to say that post-memory is a type of hallucination would be risible. Perhaps it would be more convincing to consider post-memory in connection with another activity that Ricoeur likens to quasi-hallucination, the writing of history. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Thuan. We have had the opportunity to listen to other forms of histories who also have to do with displacements of people, overwhelming stories of traumatized memories, torn identities, and so on and so forth. So I think that was really another perspective which really suits our topic of today and helps us see more about these terrifying stories, and also this phenomenon of namesacking as forms at the same time of memories, but also as resistance, as fight, and so on and so forth. So I am very interested, and also maybe I'll start with you, and I'll also start from the end with this concept of post-memory, which you link to productive hallucination. Could you please elaborate more on that in this with this type of stories? So what how can that form of space memory also help you, or maybe people with whom you discuss, to highlight this form of biographies, torn identities, and so on and so forth?
Wow, I was really hoping the last quote would kind of answer that question. But, you know, I think post-memory is about intergenerational trauma, right? And the way that Marianne Hirsch talks about it, it kind of opens it up to us to kind of be active agents within that space. You know, I'm inspired by people like Octavia Butler, who kind of use fiction as a tool. And I think, like, you know, when people are in between spaces, you know, I've done a lot of studies on, you know, islands that have become refugee camps after the Vietnam War. Like, the things that people make with their imaginations are remarkable. And I think that comes out of a need, like a really deep-seated need to kind of take control. And this is exactly what we did here. We kind of wrote from this place that was very real, very grounded in people's personal experience that comes out of a larger kind of historical context, right? And we inserted our imagination into those pockets, into those gaps, into those places of nothingness, the places that have been taken away because of migration, because of war, because of colonialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I find it very interesting and productive, as I was saying, that way of imagining reality and realizing imagination, and this special issue of dealing with these forms of stories. So maybe I would like to mention another title that you have here that I met in your work, where you speak of sounds,
Yeah.
which have to do with troubled horizon.
Right.
Yes, I would also like you maybe to link the two stories.
Yeah. Maybe the university can invite me back later to talk about that project. But
that is Unburied Sounds of Troubled Horizon.
One of my recent projects is a 60-minute film called The Unburied Sounds of a Troubled Horizon. And this is a fictional film based on stories that I had received that had been shared during my research in Quang Tri. Quang Tri is a city that sits right below the DMZ, the demilitarized zone of the 17th parallel in Vietnam that separated Vietnam as north and south. And because of where it is, it's one of the most heavily bombed places on earth. You know, I think there's 15 million tons of ordnance used during the Vietnam War, which is 3 times as much as like World War I and World War II combined. It's abstract because the numbers are so like large, it becomes really abstract, but I think, you know, it gives us a kind of sense of the scale, right? And 1/3 of all the ordnance that was used did not explode when it was supposed to. So it was exploding now during the 50 years of peacetime. So I was looking at these bombs, these unexploded bombs that sit just right below the ground as kind of a form of memory, like a catastrophic kind of ready, volatile form of memory that is hidden, but it's just there. And it affects all the farmers. You can't work the land because there's so many bombs in the land. And children have been affected by these bombs tremendously. So the film works with the community and kind of unburies all these stories from that community. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.
So I'd like to come back to to you, Bodika. During your presentation, you mentioned a word that I would like us to maybe elaborate more on it. That is delinking. Delinking? Yeah. So how do you feel it really sought in these, let's say, struggles to evolve or enhance new epistemologies? Yeah, with this.
Okay, I'm just trying to think when delinking means disconnecting.
Yeah.
Things which now.
Because I link it with, let's say, another a researcher, which is Mignolo, Walter Mignolo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't get me started on that subject now
Okay.
because no, it'll take us completely out of the thing. But now I'm just trying to remember what context I used the term. Does anybody remember? Yeah. So, but it's sometimes we just in a general thing. We bring things together. We link them, and which are, in a sense, sometimes artificial. Even that linking is an act of marginalizing, displacing other things.
Yeah.
So sometimes delinking, disconnecting, opens up the space
That's
to
it.
bring in, that's sort of the larger issue. Now, I don't remember what context I use the term in.
But I think that's the point. That is to enhance new epistemologies and also maybe to bring to light maybe some forms of marginalized and so on and so on.
A scholarship works in different ways. Sometimes it it doesn't connect things which actually belong together. So if you put different things in the same frame, you can tell a very different story. And similarly, sometimes when things are artificially kept together and you take them apart, that again opens up the space for new insights. So that's the sort of the idea behind it.
Okay, that's and also in the same point, you also, I think, mentioned some forms of maybe or let's say the value of new curatorial practices.
Did I talk about
curatorial practices?
Where did I mention? I haven't talked about it today, but yes, I can say something because I've also worked with museums because since art history and sort of the museum are sort of inseparably related, and sometimes I think I've worked in exhibitions with the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen. It was a whole project called Museum Global, where they try to bring to break out of the standard narrativism narrative of global modernism, saying that it emanates from a kind of European center, it spreads to the rest of the world, which then produces these second-hand derivative versions of the modern. So that's a kind of it's a scholarly narrative. How do you translate that into the medium of an exhibition? How do you make that visible in the medium of an exhibition? And this is what the curators did. We developed together this concept of micro stories. So instead of, talking about sort of one center and everything else, you actually delve into each of the areas, each of the regions which produce these experiments of the modern, and you investigate their dynamics, and then you bring them in the space of the exhibition where people can walk. So they see how certain kinds of, actors are traveling across the world, how, surrealism, the whole surrealist movement, we think of surrealism immediately as a French canon, and part of the French canon. If you look at how artists in Syria or Egypt, worked with some of these ideas, which were germinating through connections, through traveling individuals, and and create a form of art which is surrealist, then you realize, what does surrealism really look like? I mean, what are our preconceived notions about it? So this is how sometimes, you can use objects in the medium of an exhibition can do more than scholarship can, because you can also have a kind of associative way of putting things together. And the other thing is that, there are lots and lots of people who go to museums, to exhibitions, who've never seen the inside of a university. So you're reaching out to, a different, and you're making something which is sort of abstract in the language of scholarship. You're actually making it plastic and concrete. You're seeing it, you're making the object tell a story which it has not been able to tell earlier, because museums frame the object in a particular way. This is what we did in Dresden, for example, in the Kunstsammlung with a lot of objects. How can you curate objects differently, where they can tell the palimpsestic histories, rather than just be framed belonging to one place and one style, which conventional museum labels it. So this is what I don't know whether I talked about it in another context here.
I just summarize what you said about this, the link between, let's say, curatorial practices and unlearning.
Yeah.
That's
So unlearning here is about, discarding a frame that exists, and maybe relearning the life of, or the story of that particular object from, for all its histories of violence, of appropriation, of reconfiguration, of a new life when it becomes a museum object. There's a whole taxonomic transformation that takes place.
Yes. Okay. So I would like to know, do you believe, because we are talking here of scholar and we are talking of museum practices, for example, I would like, maybe with your help, Link would say that maybe this has to do mostly with academic or with museum world. So how can we link the two to enhance these unlearning processes at any level? Because nowadays, like you are saying, academics are working in museums, and museum people are finding themselves in the academia. And so these, let's say, traveling between the two worlds, yes, how can we manage it?
Yeah, it's an experience which is both challenging, which is very rewarding, but it also requires, a certain humility. I can't go to a museum and from my ivory tower and say, okay, tell the curators, this is what you have to do. I mean, that's not the way to do it, And for me, it was actually as a real learning experience to see how curators actually work with objects. What are the kind of conditions that that they work in? Things that I don't realize. I have the luxury to do my own research and to write what I'm convinced about. But to translate that into a different medium and to sort of to concretize it and to do it, and and when you curate something and you want to tell a story, you don't put sort of a whole wall full of text on the wall. You have to find other ways. Sometimes just put objects next to each other and make them talk. Sometimes objects which don't generally belong, because your understandings of styles places them in different places. Sometimes they place them in very different museums. Some objects which are historically linked to each other. But because today we have museums of fine arts, museums of Asian art, museums of everyday objects, museums of, the categorization goes on endlessly. So sometimes you separate things. If you actually bring them together, and you can do this more easily in the space of a temporary exhibition, you may be able to tell a different kind of narrative, and which is also an art historical narrative. So I think those are some of the things that that museums have the potential of doing, and that's and so it's a learning experience on both sides. I think it was but you also have to unlearn your own positions sometimes.
So do you have the feeling that there is need of maybe of a transnational curatorial team to be able to realize such an unlearning process?
I think that's helpful because again, you would have perspectives and positions from different contexts, which you then bring together. So you might be able to, to look at the objects from many, many different perspectives, because an object doesn't have one life. That's why I like to think of it as a palimpsest. And I think that can certainly be a fruitful exercise.
So thank you very much. So I would like maybe to engage in the same direction with Tuan. It's true that you are not dealing maybe with museum objects, but I would like...
I will be soon.
You will be. So maybe can you tell us a bit about, because you told me about the experience to come, and that you'll be dealing actually with museums objects. Do you have the feeling that maybe, like in this project, you happen maybe to question people who are not from the same background, and so that is this collaborative work that can help to see things from different standpoints? Do you have the feeling that the same can be implemented in the new work with objects that you are going to engage with?
Yeah, actually I'm not in a position, because it's too early in the project, to speak about that project. But I do think that if we can connect these objects with communities that have an investment, a cultural or personal investment in the lives of these objects, I think something else can come about. Yeah, I mean, there's not much that I can say about it yet, because I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. But I also see, like, the extraction of, cultural artifacts from different communities. I see it kind of in parallel, since we're talking about tirailleurs and colonial soldiers. I think, the invention of the colonial soldier is a very extractive project, right? I mean, it's the ultimate colonial act, right? To take these bodies, to extract these bodies for the profit of the European story in defense of Europeans and French lives it's like psychologically perverse, because now you have a colonized body that works at the will and the intent of the colonizer. Like, how do you process that psychology, right? And, I see a lot of kind of looking at, objects and kind of the idea of restitution and repair, and then, like, how do you repair these histories of these people that have gone through this horrible kind of psychological process of enabling the colonizer within the body of the colonized.
Yes, that is actually what Aimé Césaire was called colonization thingification. That is to this process of objectifying people, transforming people into commodities, commodification of people, which did not take place only during colonial wars, during this First or Second World War, but it was really, as you are saying, a colonial project to take people from India to Kenya, from Senegal to Saigon, from Cameroon to Namibia or to Tanzania, and so on and so forth. I would like maybe to come back to these people. So have you found in the process of investigating their stories, maybe specific objects that also play maybe a particular role in the transfer processes of these people, and which also specific objects, maybe from Senegal to Saigon or from Saigon to Senegal. Have you found such things?
In my collaboration with this specific community, my friends in Senegal, the objects that kind of came
That
about,
is objects that really function as maybe an attachment to these different families, torn from here to there and so.
yeah, the recurring kind of objects that I kind of encountered in a lot of these personal stories were actually photographs. So photographs became really kind of instrumental in kind of memorializing a narrative, a story, a kind of personal kind of investment in a very kind of turbulent time. And letters, just like Makadu's letter, like it gave him access to this whole other alternative life that he had never known. So letters and photographs have been quite crucial. And so when we first were able to, after the pandemic, we were able to bring the film back to Senegal to show to the community. It was part of Dakar's Biennale in association, in collaboration with Raw Material Company. Oh, Koyo sends her love, by the way, Benedict. It was truly kind of wonderful experience because people from the communities actually started to bring their photos to be displayed as part of the exhibition in conjunction with the film. And so there was a very interesting kind of correlation between narrative, the narratives that were happening within this 4-channel video installation, and then the kind of very real, tactile, like material essence of these photographs that were just hanging right outside the wall. And then people and, grandchildren and, great-grandchildren were coming into the exhibition space and suddenly having access to these images that were kind of buried in the closet in albums somewhere. So yeah, so that was my experience.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Janita,
Yeah, I'm just,
Monica, please.
Since the conversation also between people who are coming from two different angles, what's really striking is that today, an artist works with materials that we also as scholars use, photographs, archives, memories, material objects, and yet they subject them to very, very different protocols. And I think that can be really productive because in the end, what you show by reading all these materials is something which I kind of mentioned in a very abstract way. You're showing actually these lives, these experiences, these subjectivities of individuals which have been repressed from the national narrative, which have no place in a national narrative because it envisages culture differently, the kind of, and I think those, so you're able to enter into these crevices and extract these subjectivities. So I think that's another dimension. So it's not just art history and the museum. I think art history and practicing artists also can, in this kind of dynamic conversation, be very productive in sort of knowledge sharing, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe before I give the floor to the public, maybe you would like to say one more thing. If not, then I will just, okay, then please, you have the floor since, yeah. Thank you for listening. Okay, thank you, wonderful audience. Thank you, Monica, thank you, Tuan. I think we have spent wonderful moments here, and I think there have been many questions. There have also been many answers, but I think there is one thing that we would, I think, keep while going out is that there is no just one model or method that can be applied in this unlearning process everywhere and at any time. So, and with this, I hand the floor to Lee, and thank you very much again for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for our guests for tonight and for you for hosting, Richard. Before you can have your drinks, I want to invite you to the next season, season 4 of KuK Tuesdays Dislocation. As you can see maybe on the flyers on your seats. The next session is on the 23rd of April, and the title is Dislocated Languages. You have touched it earlier. The confirmed speakers are Gwendolyn Choi, a PhD student from the University of Oxford, Dora Cheng, a playwright, author, theater artist in Berlin, and this panel will be hosted by my dear colleague Mikael Asilkinka, the newest doctor in town. He just defended his thesis 2 weeks ago. And since this is the last season of the last session of season 3, Freya and I want to take this occasion to thank you all, to thank Benedict for giving us the space to experiment. Thank you to Eike and Elsa to answering every tiny question about TU administration. Thank you to Merten Lagertz and Inigo Salto Santa Maria for carrying this lectern today. And also heavy objects in the past sessions. And a huge thank you to my dear colleagues who are always working behind the scenes. Eileen Burdem, Lea Carlson, and Hannah Imam. And thank you. And we will see, give them an applause. And see you on the 23rd of April and have some drinks and snacks. Thank you.